4th of this year, I happened to be on Twitter that morning having coffee, having some breakfast, and I saw this tweet that I thought was really funny, but apparently an awful lot of other people did not think that it was funny. It was a tweet from Chris Rock, and because he is a stand-up comedian, of course, it was rather humorous, and I thought it was perfect for the day, right? What Chris Rock said on July 4th was this. He said, "Happy White People's Independence Day." And he went on, which I thought, I mean, he could have stopped right there, and that would have been really funny. But he went on, and he said, "The slaves weren't free, but I'm sure they enjoyed the fireworks," which is also pretty funny. Now, all Chris Rock was saying, really, in that 140-character burst of energy, right, was we don't all see history the same way, right? And we don't see it the same way because we haven't lived it the same way. We haven't experienced the country the same way. It's really the same thing that Frederick Douglass said well over 150 years ago in his speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," in which he made basically the same argument that Chris Rock was making. Granted, Frederick Douglass made it in a little bit prettier and more prose-worthy way rather than a 140-character tweet, you know. Speeches were a bit more eloquent, I suppose, 150 years ago than what we do today online. But the message was basically the same. The message was, you have your historical memory, and by God, I have my historical memory, and they aren't the same. Now, one would think that these very simple words from Chris Rock wouldn't really be that controversial, because after all, what he was saying was true. July 4th simply didn't mean the same to black folk. It certainly didn't mean the same to indigenous native North American peoples as it meant to white folks. And to be honest, it didn't mean the same to white women that it meant to white men. And it didn't mean the same to poor folks without land that it meant to rich folks with lots of land. I mean, obviously, there are many different ways of remembering that era. But apparently, there were a lot of folks who received Chris Rock's Twitter feed who weren't at all happy about what Chris Rock said. And one individual in particular really summed up for me the all too common and very disturbing way in which certain members of the white American community respond to any discussion about racism at all, right? Any discussion of racism past or present. This is how too many white folks respond. It was an individual from South Carolina who fashions himself to be some type of conservative blogger online, but actually he makes his money in his day job as a divorce attorney. So, you know, I suppose one has to do what one has to do, even as one defends family values from those of us who ostensibly would destroy them. But in any event, this blogger, who I'll call Jeff because that's his name, Jeff Schreiber, actually, is his name. Jeff was very upset at Chris Rock, and so he tweeted back. Now, first lesson, and if you don't learn anything else today, this would probably be the thing to learn. You should never get in a Twitter war with a stand-up comedian. Because it is not going to go well for you.
Hello brothers and sisters, welcome back to the channel. Well, I'm hoping that you're doing great from wherever you're watching me from. As you know, I'm your host and presenter Jintok Stories. Well, I'm hoping that you're doing great. Now, do you think that racism really went away? Or do you think that slavery is still happening in the United States? These are critical questions that we need to ask ourselves looking at everything that is happening today. Probably not as much intense as it was before, but truly trust me, it still exists. And why am I saying so? In the speech that Mr. Tim Wise gives in 2012, it's a speech on the legacy of slavery and the myth of emancipation, which is a powerful critique of how racism has evolved in America, right? Not through its eradication, but through its adaptation. Dr. Tim Wise, a white anti-racist educator and author, argued that the United States never truly abolished the underlying logic of slavery. It merely changed its outer appearance. Now, you need to understand that this speech really focused on the idea that while chattel slavery may have ended in 1865, that's during the emancipation, the racial hierarchy that justified it remained still intact, which is embedded in the structures, psychological, and political economy of American life. His insights from 2012 resonates even more deeply today, right? In the era of mass incarceration, racial wealth inequality, and political backlash against racial justice movements. I want us to buckle up for this video. Really, really important, really, really educative. And you need to understand the perspective that he talks from, because he talks from a perspective of a white person. And it tells you all those blind spots that sometimes we assume that, racism went away, it doesn't exist, when it focuses on other things that are really, really important. But Tim Watts will tell you that no. And in fact, it is really the problem. Racism is a problem, a big, big, big problem in the United States. Even today, that's what he's going to be telling you. And he's going to be telling you why. Because it's going to be giving you a perfect example and it's going to make sense to you. And now, I'm just going to be asking you right front, if you're watching us for the first time, I'm asking you to please subscribe to the channel, join our membership, and really get to see what we can offer you, right? Because I don't want you to be left behind when we are learning all these important concepts. So guys, buckle up for this video. As you know, I'm your host and presenter, Generic Stories. I'll be back with my presentation. I'll be back with my commentary at the end of us sharing this speech and learning something out of it. Because in as much as the United States is trying to push the idea that racism or slavery still doesn't exist, but trust me, it's still fresh, but just in a different form. So let's watch the video. I'll be back.
And it did not go well for Jeff. So Jeff responds, and he, how you do on Twitter, you have the hashtag and whatever you want to say that you're hoping people will then follow throughout the day. So his hashtag was, and I'm going to clean it up and make it a G-rated version of what Jeff said. His version was quite a bit more R-rated, but what he said was hashtag go F yourself, which I'm assuming is language he learned in divorce court among some of his clients who probably speak that way to one another in the midst of their divorce. So Jeff says, go F yourself, and then he goes on to say, slavery existed for 2,000 years before America. We ended it in 100 years, and now we have a black president. Right? So there, basically, is what Jeff was saying to Chris Rock, replying to a historically accurate statement made by Chris Rock with a totally irrelevant rebuttal that has nothing to do with anything, but is the way that oftentimes white folks respond to any discussion about racism. Essentially, think about what Jeff said. Let's break it down into three parts. The first thing he says is the old "they did it too" defense, right? Well, yes, we enslaved other human beings, but other countries also did that, and they did it for 2,000 years, so really you can't blame us. Now, let's think about this defense for a minute. I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I remember trying to use this defense with my mother. On one particular occasion when I had managed, with the help of a friend, to break a window in a neighboring apartment playing baseball. And I remember going to my mother after I was in pretty big trouble for breaking this window and saying something to the effect of, well, it wasn't just me playing baseball. Billy was also throwing the ball, so it's also his fault. Now, as I remember, and you may or may not have had a similar experience, my mother looked at me and said something about Billy and a bridge, and whether, if young William were to throw himself from that bridge, whether I would, in the manner of a damn fool, follow him. Which is to say, she wasn't very impressed by the fact that someone else had been in on the breaking of the window, just like I don't think we ought to be impressed by the fact that throughout human history, people have injured other people, and therefore we need not deal with the injury that we have helped to perpetrate or from which we have in some way as a nation benefited. But that was his first line of defense. We don't need to talk about that because they did it too. The second aspect of his tweet is that we ended slavery in 100 years, which always leads me to ask when others use the word we to describe something, just who is the we that you're talking about? Because the truth is, those who were the conservative activists of the slavery era certainly were not in on that work. Right? They were not the ones who were the abolitionists or the emancipationists. Yes, the Republican Party of those days was the abolitionist party. They were the party more given to emancipation, but conservatives of their day, which is what Jeff is today, right, were the ones trying to preserve the traditional institution of enslavement. And so Jeff can say all he wishes that we ended slavery, but now some people ended it and a lot of other people just sat around and defended it. And I feel confident that if Jeff had been alive 150 years ago, where he would have sat in that particular conflict. The third thing he says, and this is the funniest of all, he says, now we have a black president. Okay, I am very confident that Jeff had no part in making that happen. I mean, I read his blog. I know that he had nothing to do with that, but he'll take credit for it if it will get him out of a conversation about the historical crime of enslavement. We now have a black president. Yes, the same black president whose election, not once but twice, has now apparently provoked an outpouring of racist hostility, whether it is in the form of racist emails or racist signs at rallies that have been seen both here in Washington and around the country over the last 4 years, or the racist protests that erupted just last week at the University of Mississippi and also at Hampton-Sydney, or the racist tweets and claims that it would be a good thing were the president to be assassinated that we've seen going around the internet. We have 30 states, you may or may not have seen this, but 30 states now where individuals in the last week have petitioned the United States government for the right to secede from the Union because Barack Obama was reelected. I mean, this is taking sore losing to an entirely new level beyond anything that I have ever witnessed before. Because this man who you didn't support wins re-election, you wish to secede from the Union? If black folks threatened to secede from the Union every time an election had not gone their way, they would have left a long damn time ago. But apparently folks like Mr. Jeff in South Carolina and others believe that this new multicultural, multiracial, very different America from the one that they grew up in and prefer is somehow a dangerous, dangerous destruction of all that we hold dear in our American tradition. Well, some of those traditions are dear, and some of those traditions are worth preserving. But an awful lot of them, like the 200-plus year period of enslavement that emancipation brought to an end, was certainly not among those traditions that were worth preserving. And so we come together today to talk about that, not because we wish to stay in the past, right? Peoples of color, as much as anyone, more than anyone, do not wish to stay in the past. But those who have been the targets of oppression in history understand, perhaps far better than the rest of us, that history is mightily important, is critical for us to remember so that we do not, in fact, repeat the mistakes of that history. And of course, let us be honest, just because this nation has made progress, and just because this nation has elected now not once but twice a black man as president of the United States, does not tell us anything in and of itself about the larger issues of institutional racial inequality. How do we know that? Well, I could spend literally a semester of academic life demonstrating it to you with data and facts and figures and statistics. It wouldn't be very hard to prove, and I'm sure you have professors here who talk about those things and demonstrate those things every day in class. But beyond that, we don't even have to look at the data to know that. All we have to do is think of an analogy that would help prove the point. And so, for instance, this idea that the election of a man of color somehow signifies the death of racism as a force in America doesn't make any more sense than it would make to say that the election of a woman, Benazir Bhutto, in Pakistan, she was elected in 1988 and again in 1991. No one would say that her election meant that sexism had been eradicated in Pakistan, that somehow the mistreatment of women was no longer there just because a woman had been elected. So too, women have been elected as the head of state in Israel and India and Great Britain and the Philippines and several other places, not here yet, right? But if I were to say to the women in this room, if I were to say to my own two daughters who are 11 and 9 years of age, you know, what you really ought to do is pack your bags and move to Pakistan so that you will now have equal opportunity. I'm assuming that every woman in here, and even my 9-year-old daughter who knows nothing about Pakistan, would still say, no, Daddy, no, that's not a good idea at all. Because we understand in those cases that the individual at the top of the political power structure does not necessarily tell us much about the larger structure. So if in this country we have approximately 90 million peoples of color overall, the fact that the most powerful political player in that country is a person of color does not tell you much about the rest of that 90 million, right? Because there are approximately 90 million black folks in this country whose names are neither Barack Obama nor Oprah Winfrey, and whose lives do not necessarily mirror the lives of those individuals who have obtained those high positions of authority. So we have to dig deeper if we really want to understand the legacy of the Emancipation Act, and more to the point, the legacy of the enslavement that made it necessary. The reason we talk about this, and not just in a history class, is because the past comes into the present. The past affects the present. Back in 3rd or 4th grade science class, I remember learning about, and you probably did too, this concept of inertia, right? The idea that an object in motion will tend to continue in the same direction, right, in motion until it is stopped by a force of equal or greater power to prevent it from continuing on its way. So if you roll a rock down a hill, it's going to keep going until the hill ends or it runs into a wall or something, right? That's inertia. But inertia is not just a physical property, you see. It's not just a property of the physical universe. Inertia is, in a very real sense, also a property of the political universe. It is a property of the economic universe. So those things which happen in one generation will affect the next generation and the next generation and the next generation until, like that rock, they come up against a force of equal or greater weight to push against it, you see. And although we have had those counterweights at various points in our history, those forces that pushed against that inertia, there is no way that we can look around and actually believe that those counter forces have been adequate to reverse the effects of that history. Let us talk about the two ways in which this legacy continues into the 21st century. First, there is the material inequality, the economic inequalities of the present era, which directly stem from that long legacy of racial oppression, including enslavement, but also segregation and other forms of discrimination. That material inequality begins historically in the era of enslavement at a time when white folks, and only white folks, were able to first be considered citizens. That was the decision of the United States Congress, the very first law that the Congress passed after the Constitution was ratified. The very first thing that they did before they did anything else was pass a law called the Naturalization Act of 1790. And what the Naturalization Act of 1790 said, among other things, was that all free white persons and only free white persons could be citizens of the United States. In other words, only they were really deserving of the rights and the liberties granted in the Constitution. That was the law of the land. It gave those of us who were white, or our ancestors, preferential treatment. It was a form of affirmative action if we were using honest language, but we didn't use that honest language a couple hundred years ago, right? Affirmative action is what we think of when we do anything to try to level the playing field. But why wasn't that affirmative action for those who were white, particularly white property-owning men, right? Because it was a form of preference. And white folks, as a result of that preference, were able to accumulate stuff, were able to accumulate land and money, and of course, other human beings in far too many cases, at a time when peoples of color were being routinely blocked from being able to accumulate land and property. And when you're not allowed in the first generation to accumulate property, you can't do what? You can't hand down that property to one's children or grandchildren. And so what becomes a small inequality perhaps in the first generation, by the third or the fourth generation, after that property has cycled down through the generations, now that inequality gets even bigger, right? Because the thing about wealth and property is it tends to accumulate value very quickly, right? Because of interest, right? If you own land or you have money in the bank, interest means that that's going to grow at a much faster rate than just money itself in your pocket, right? So over time, that first, that second, that third American generation was able to give to its children and grandchildren an extreme head start that is still with us today. In fact, today, the typical white family in this country, not the typical rich white family, just the typical right in the middle white family, has about 20 times the net worth of the typical African American family, about 18 times the net worth of the typical Latino family. It is not because we've worked harder, God knows. It is not because we have prayed harder, God certainly knows. And it is not because we as white folks possess some superior investment wisdom about which people of color are lacking. I mean, if you have paid no attention at all to what's happened in the last 5 years on Wall Street, you should at least be able to know this much, that a handful of rich white dudes can lose a hell of a lot of money. And they can do it without any help from black people. They can do it without any help from Latino people, any help from Asian Americans, no Native Americans, just a handful of the richest, smartest, most educated white guys on Wall Street, and they lost approximately $12 trillion of other people's money over the course of about an 18-month period. Think about that. 12 trillion wiped off the books by rich white dudes. If black people stole $12 trillion of other people's money, there would be a congressional investigation. People would be going to jail and prison for long periods of time. That too is the legacy of racism, a differential standard for white folks who break the rules as opposed to people of color who break the rules, you see. That too is part of that legacy. But it wasn't just enslavement that created this inequality. It's also the fact that when the government tried, and it did, for just a brief moment, tried to rectify some of that legacy with the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau and the Freedmen's Bank, which were two institutions established in the post-slavery period specifically for the purpose of helping those who had been formerly owned as property to get their own land, their own tools, right, and the ability to start their lives over as free people. It was an effort, if you will, at reparations, although not a huge effort, but still an important one. And yet, the Supreme Court of the United States, within just a few years of the time that those institutions were set up, struck them down, got rid of them, ruled that they were not constitutional. And when they did so, in 1883, one of the Supreme Court justices, Joseph Bradley, made the famous comment that the reason we didn't need to help those who had been formerly enslaved was because it was time for them to stop being the special favorites of the law. The special favorites of the law, as if somehow black folks were being specially favored just because they had a Freedmen's Bureau and a Freedmen's Bank, ignoring the fact that it was actually white Americans who had been the special favorites when they were made citizens and nobody else was, for 200 years going back to the colonial period when they and only they could accumulate property. But Joseph Bradley and his colleagues on the court basically say in 1883, so we're talking, 20 years essentially after emancipation, and only about a decade after these institutions were established to help the former slaves, is basically saying, okay, enough of that. Enough of all that help. And he then said, and this is part of his actual statement, it's time for the Negro to become no longer the special favorite of the laws, but to take his place as a mere citizen, right? Now, keeping in mind that black folks hadn't even been able to be citizens at all up until a few years before this. And you can see the irony in the comment, right? But the point is, when the government tried to do something at the time to deal with this legacy, the Supreme Court struck it down. That's why we're still talking about it. Because when some folks wanted to do right by the newly emancipated peoples and wanted to make sure that they had truly equal opportunity or something at least close to it, the highest court said no, that we couldn't do that. And here we are, 150 years after emancipation, never having taken those steps for more than a handful of years, wondering why we're still having to talk about it. Well, that's why we're still having to talk about it. And of course, in 1862, the very same year that the D.C. Emancipation Act was put into effect, that we're here today to remember, that was the same year that this government passed the Homestead Act. And what was the Homestead Act? The Homestead Act was a law that gave out over 250 million acres of basically free land to white folks. People of color were blocked in almost all cases from being able to obtain that land. And of course, that land had been stolen from native peoples. So this was in every sense a redistribution of resources from people of color to white folks. So the Homestead Act is passed, gives out all of this free land that allows white families to accumulate wealth. That too gets passed down. And so today, the estimates are that there are about 50 million white Americans still living on that land that their ancestors received, or not living on it, but they have benefited from it because it has been sold over those years and the money ultimately stayed in the family. So in some way, 50 million white folks have benefited from this huge government program. Now, if people of color had done that, we would call that a handout. We would call that a welfare program. We would blame the recipients for not wanting to work hard enough for their stuff, because that's what folks say today whenever we talk about something like food support, or we talk about income support, paltry little income support, or housing assistance, or God forbid, a health insurance plan that covers pre-existing conditions. When we talk about those minor things, folks say, well, now that's a handout for the lazy. But when you give out 250 million acres of somebody else's land to white folks so they can have farms and ranches and houses and pass that down to their children, we don't call that a handout. We call that nation building, you see. That's the difference, very different form of analysis. And so today we have these massive inequalities. We see that right here in Washington, D.C. You don't have to look elsewhere to see this inequality, right? You are in a town that has among the highest income gaps between white folk and black folk of any city in this country. We know, for instance, when it comes to unemployment and joblessness, that folks west of the Anacostia River have an unemployment rate under 9%. Even that is too high. Right? But folks who are east of the Anacostia have an unemployment rate of 35%. So we're talking almost 4 times the rate of unemployment between two communities separated by a river. And as you know, it's not a very wide river, right? And yet it is wide enough to mask these huge disparities in opportunity. There is currently, as I'm sure many of you know, a 73-point gap.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. Well, I'm hoping that you're doing great from wherever you're watching me from. I'm your host and presenter, Digital Stories. These are things that we need to talk about. I really find them important. First, is perspective about really racism and slavery, as it's still being embedded in the structures, as it's still embedded in the structures of the United States. We have a couple of important things that we can talk about. And I had some takeaway points that while I was listening to the speech, I came up with, and I think that it's important for us to, share, talk about this and discuss it, because it's part of us getting to learn all these concepts. First of all, the idea that emancipation was not a moral reckoning, but a strategic and incomplete act, while the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except as the punishment for a crime. This loophole allowed slavery to mutate into prison industrial complex. Dr. Tim Wise emphasizes that white society never confronted the moral depravity of slavery, but instead it rebranded its tools of racial control from chain gangs and black codes to Jim Crow laws and modern incarceration. This, Tim Wise insists, that is why racism persists, because America never addressed the foundational belief that black lives are less valuable. And it's a problem that it's something we need to address, something that we need to talk about. While I was listening to this speech, I also noticed that Wiles also discussed about the psychological and cultural wages of whiteness. Borrowing from who? We Du Bois, right? He explored how poor and working class white Americans have historically given false sense of superiority over black people as a consolation prize for their own exploitation. This psychological wage was meant to divide potential multiracial solidarity. Wise warned that even in the modern times, many white Americans cling to these racial myths to maintain identity and pride in the system that economically fails them too. This helps explain why poor whites vote against their own interest when seduced by racial grievance politics. Really important. Another major thrust of White's argument that I also listen is that racism is not merely about individual hate or prejudice. It is a structural, it is systematic, it is institutional. He pointed out that white Americans benefit from racism even if they do not consciously express hate, whether it's through access to better schools, job networks, housing, or simply freedom from racial profiling. Whiteness still confers and add advantages. This is the crux of his argument, that the benefits of whiteness remains embedded in American life. even as explicit racist language becomes taboo, right? You need to get to understand that in discussing the modern echoes of slavery, Dr. Tim Wise made a critical link between the economic logic of slavery and today's racial capitalism. He argued that Africans were exploited not just because of hate, but because they were a source of free labor, marginalized, an economy engine. Today, black people remain economically marginalized, often confined to underpaid, precarious jobs, and disproportionately harmed by economic crisis. Wise posited that unless these exploitative economic structures is dismantled, racism will simply continue to evolve in new forms. Right? Also, one of the most compelling parts of white speech in its challenge to white America is to see racism not as a black problem, and they usually say this, I agree, but as their problem, one that they are morally responsible for confronting. He urged white people to stop viewing racial justice as an act of charity or guilt relief, and instead to see it as an act of justice, accountability. This call is even more relevant today as backlash against the diversity, equity, inclusion, that's the DEI, which effortlessly intensifies as many white Americans claim fatigue or feel attacked when racial inequity is being brought up. Dr. Tim Wise also emphasized that the progress is not linear. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 was not a proof of post-racial society, and he argued it was in many ways the catalyst for renewed racial backlash. Indeed, in his hindsight, his wording proved prophetic. The rise of the Tea Party, Batherism, and eventually Donald Trump's presidency were all fueled by white anxiety over demographic change and perceived loss of status. Dr. Tim Wise insists that the real progress requires sustained struggle, not symbolic milestones. Also, another powerful element of speech that Dr. Tim Wise reminded us was that racism adapts to its environment. After slavery came segregation. After segregation came mass incarceration. And the war on drugs. After explicit racism came colorblind policies that ignored systemic harm. This adaptive nature makes racism harder to fight because it hides behind new language, new policies, and even liberal ideals like meritocracy and equal opportunity, which often masks inequality rather than eliminates it. Also, Dr. Tim Wise challenges liberal and Democrats and moderates not to be complacent. He argues that silence in the face of injustice is complicity, and that colorblindness is a form of denial. In his view, anti-racism requires intentionality, discomfort, and confrontation. Simply not being a racist is not enough. One must actively work to dismantle racist structures and unlearn internalized biases. This remains one of the most misunderstood principles in today's discussions about race. He also connected racism to national identity and memory. Dr. Tim Wise noted that American history is being sanitized. Slavery is often taught as tragedy, but not as a crime. Civil rights leaders are remembered in abstract terms of peace and unity, rather than radical critics of American injustice. This erasure, he argued, is intentional. It allows white Americans to feel patriotic without acknowledging the cost of that patriotism for black people and other marginalized groups. Reclaiming history, therefore, becomes essential to justice. Also, in reflecting on what emancipation should have meant, Wise argued for a deeper kind of freedom, economical, social, and psychological. He believed that without repair and redistribution, emancipation remains symbolic. True emancipation would mean access to education, wealth, housing, and political power for descendants of the enslaved. It will mean dismantling not only racist laws, but also the racist logic that justifies inequality. Reparations in this framework are not about handouts, but about justice. What I've learned about all this 2012 speech, which still remains relevant because the myths he exposed, the myth of post-racial America, the myth of white innocence, the myth of linear progress, which still dominates disclosure. Remember that his analysis has helped me as a learner to understand why racial inequality remains still entrenched and why good intentions are not enough. The legacy of slavery was never fully abolished. It was rebranded, outsourced, digitized. Until America reckons with its full historical truth and commits to radical change, the ghosts of slavery will continue to haunt its institution, its streets, and its people. I'm your host and presenter, Jintok Stories. Final plea, if you're watching us for the first time, I'm going to be asking you to please subscribe to the channel, join the membership. I really get to see what I can offer you. But until then, let me see you in my next video. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.